Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In this part of the video tutorial, we will continue working on the handle authenticate async method that we have created to authenticate the incoming request on protected admin controllers. Now, here in this method so far, just to recap, we have implemented the initial validation where we are checking if the request that comes in contains two cookies, which are one of them is the access token, the other one is the user ID. If the cookie does not contain the access token or the user ID, then we return a authentication result dot no result value back to the request. Now, if the user request contains a cookie and a user ID, then the next step will be to decrypt this cookie and get the actual values out of these encrypted cookies. If we go back to the finished project that we have created, here in the application window which contains the cookies, here you can see that the access token value is encrypted as well as the user ID is encrypted. Now, this is not the actual value, but this is the encrypted value that is stored in the cookies of the browser application window. Now, once we receive these cookies, as I mentioned, we need to decrypt them to get the actual value, and then we need to validate those values. So to decrypt the cookies, first we need to get the validation parameters for our JWT token. So our access token that is going to be attached to the cookie is basically a JWT token. A JWT is a JSON web token. And to get more information on JWT, you can go to the website jwt.io. Here you can read documentation on JWT tokens. And if you have any other questions, you can still use the comment section and I can clear your doubts. But here in this project, we are going to use the JWT tokens where we are going to encrypt them and send back those tokens to the user, which will be stored in the browser cookie called as access underscore token. So the first step in this validation would be to create the validation parameters for the token. So we need to validate the token. So we need to have certain validation parameters so that we can compare the decrypted cookie with the validation parameters and try to see if these validation parameters pass or fail. To add JWT validation parameters, we will go to the app settings file of the main project. Here in the app settings file, just below the identity default options, I'm going to add the app settings options that I need to validate the JWT token. Here I have created a key called as app settings, and the name of the key is basically the name of the class that I have created over here called as app settings. And all the properties that I have in this class, I have added the same properties as keys inside this app settings. Now this app settings object will have all these key values that will be mapped over to the properties of the app settings class. Now here the JWT validation parameters, basically you would have to provide a name for your website. So I've called it site, an audience, and for whom this JWT token will be used. It will be used for this website, which is techhowdy.com. You can replace this with your own domain. The expire time is how long you want the cookie to stay valid, how long you want the token to stay valid, and refresh token expiry time is how long you want the refresh token to stay valid. I have created a secret which I will be using to sign these JWT tokens. This secret key should not be something like what I have attached here in this particular app settings. This should be something that cannot be easily decoded. So here, to keep it simple, I have added a simple string called as Decrypting Authentication token for JWT, but you can replace this with your own string that you want to use, so it does not have to be same as mine. So the sign-in key, we need to validate that the token is signed, so I have set it to true. We need to validate the issuer of the token, the property is set to true. The audience, We need to validate the audience, so it's set to true. And do we need to allow token refresh within our website? And I have set the setting to true, and the client ID needs to be added for the cookie, which I have set a string called as the following tech howdy authentication refresh token. Now these two values, the secret and the client ID, you can replace them with your own values. It does not have to match the values that I have added over here. Also, you can change the values for expiry time, for site audience, because this is something that can be changed according to your requirement. Now we have added the validation parameters. Now the new cookie that is sent to us in the browser request, we will validate that cookie against these parameters or against these values that we have added. Going back to the admin authentication handler, here now let's work on the step 1 inside the try catch block is to create the validation parameters. So first I need to get the secret app settings.secret, that is this key that I use to sign the JWT token. So I need that key to decrypt the token as well. So I will get the value using the app settings object that we have created over here. Now the I options, the I or the interface options that we have will help us to map these app settings values in the app settings files to the app setting class properties. So it will map these values, and now we can access these values calling the property names in the class. So using that mapping from iOptions, I'm going to call the app settings.secret. By this, I can get the value of the secret key that I have over here, which is this string. Now I need to add the reference to system.text so that I can do the encoding. Next step is to create an instance of JWT token handler. So let's go ahead and do that. So we will create an object called as handler, and it will be of type JWT security handler, and we will add the reference to IdentityModel.Tokens.Jwt. We have already installed this package. If you have not watched the part 1 of this video tutorial for creating authentication, you will be able to understand how we have installed the packages. Now we will work on the step 3, which will be to create an instance of JWT token validation parameters, and let's go ahead and create that. So we are creating a token validation parameters object using Microsoft.IdentityModel.Tokens, and here we have mapped the parameters that we need to validate the token. These are the same parameters that we are going to use to decrypt the token and validate it. So the next step would be to decrypt the token, and therefore we need a instance of data protection provider so that we can use it to decrypt the cookie. So we will create an object called as protector provider, and using the iService provider instance that we have created on in the constructor and instantiated it. Using that iService provider instance, we will call the getService method, and using dependency ingestion, we will call the get the iData protection provider service. Now we need to reference AspNetCore.Data and also we are getting this error because we also need to reference one more class in this particular admin authentication handler class. So we need to add the using statement for Microsoft extension dependency injection. By adding this, now the dependency for iData protection provider will be injected. Now keep in mind that all these services that we are using in this particular class, we need to add them to the pipeline of our application, which is the startup class, and we will do that once this authentication handler class has been finished coding. So now the next step would be to add the protector instance. So we will go ahead and create an object called as protector. Using this protector provider service that we received, we will create a protector object, and we will create this protector using the application user key from the data protection key class that we have. Now this data protection keys also needs to be added to the app settings dot JSON file. So let's go ahead and add it over here so that it can be mapped over to our class. So in the app settings file, just after the app settings section, I'm going to add the data protection key section, and inside that I'm going to add a key called as application user key and just add a key value. Now this can be any type of string. You can change it as per your requirement. I have added a short string with some alphanumeric characters in it and some special characters, but you can create your own string. Also keep in mind that the name of the class should match the section. Also the property name should match the key that you have created within this section so that it can be mapped over without any issues. So now we will go back to the authentication handler, and here we will get the key from the application from the app settings using this application user key. Now the next step, we will go ahead and decrypt the user ID that we received in the HTTP request. So we are going to decrypt the user ID using the protector object, and the protector object contains a method called as unprotect. We will call that method and we will pass the header value uid.parameter. So now this header value.uid is basically the value that we had uh, received in the header for the HTTP request. So here we are sending out the value and the value is stored in the property called as header value UID, and I'm calling this same property over here which contains the value. So this encrypted value will be passed here when we call the dot parameter property, and then we will unprotect it using the method from the data protection protector. Now we have decrypted the user ID. Now we also need to decrypt the access token. So let's go ahead and decrypt the access token. So I've created another object called as decrypted token, and using the protector once again calling the unprotect method, I have passed in the value of the token which is stored inside the property called as header value. So now the first step is completed, where we have decrypted the tokens and we have stored their decrypted values inside these two objects, which is decrypted UID and decrypted token. Now during this decryption process, if there is any error, that error will be thrown, and then we have a catch block which will catch that error. We will log the error and then we will return an authentication fail response to the request. So the way this particular try block will work is we don't have an else block, so any error that is caused during this process will be termed as authentication fail. So let's go to the next step, which is to now validate the JWT token. So once we decrypt the token, this is a JWT token that we have. Now we need to validate this JWT token using the validation parameters that we have created. So to validate these parameters, first thing we need to do is check the values that we have in the database. So when a user will log in our application, the user's details like the email and password will be validated, and then we will create a encrypted token for the user and send it back. But we are also saving information about this token in our database over here. Now to save the information about this token in our database, we have not yet created a table for that. So using entity framework, we will create that table. So in your model service project, go ahead and then add a class called as token model. I have already created it. In the token model class, add the following properties: the ID, the client ID, the value is basically the value of the token, and the following properties. I have added some comments here if you don't understand why these properties are required. Also, I have created a relation between this token model table and the application user table using a foreign key attribute so that we can access the user related data. Now, keep in mind that this property is virtual, which means there is no column for this property created in your table. It will be only used to fetch data about the users and to validate the information about the user. We don't need to create a column for that in the table. So I have left it as virtual. Now, make sure when you go to the app filter service, right click on it and now add reference to the data service, which is the project which holds all your database related information. So add that and then click OK. Next thing that you want to do, go to your application DB context class and add the DB set for the token model that we created so that we can perform certain queries on this particular table. Now go back to the admin authentication uh, class that we are working on, or the filter, and here we need to create a token model object, and then we need to create a scope, and we have to run a query on the database using entity framework. So once you have added this query, you would need to add some import statements. You would need the import statement for entity framework, system link, and data service. So these three import statements need to be added so that you don't get any errors in this query that we are performing. Now what this query is doing, it's going to the token table and checking if the decrypted user ID that we have, does it match any record in our token model table. So this decrypted user ID, does it match any user's ID in the table? Does it match any username? So we are going to receive a username in the cookie. Does any username matches the username that we have received in the cookie? And we are also checking if the role of that user is administrator, because we are creating a filter for the admin. So we want to check that the role also is in the administrator role and not some other role. So if we get any result, what we are going to do is we are going to save that result in this particular object that we created, which is token model, so that we can access this object outside the scope. I have put this object outside the using statement. So now let's code further. So for those who still find it confusing, I have added some comments here, and I have uh, broken down the steps into different parts like step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. So you can understand what is going on and how the process works. So now after we get the existing token for the user from the database using a scope request, we need to check if this token has a value or it's null. So step 11 would be to check if the token model is null. If the token model is null, that means we don't have any token stored for this user, and therefore we are going to return a result of authentication fail stating that the user is not authorized to view this page. We will add a message to that. Now, if the token model is not null, that will be step number 12 to validate it further. Now we need to do the layer 2 decryption of the token. We have already decrypted the token in layer 1. Now we need to decrypt the token in layer 2 because there is 2 level of encryption on our token. So the step 12 will include is the decryption of the token on the second layer. So here we will create a protector instance once again. We will call this protector instance as layer 2 protector, and we will create this protector instance using the key that we received from our database. So we had stored a key that we used to encrypt the user token, or this specific user token. So that key is being fetched, and now that key is used to decrypt this token at the second level. Now we will decrypt the token and store the value in this property called as decrypted token for layer 2. Now we move on to the step 13. In step 13, we will validate the JWT token using the validation parameters that we created in step 3 Earlier we created certain validation parameters. We will use these validation parameters to validate the decrypted JWT token. So we have created a property called as validate token, and we are using the handler.validate token method. The handler was created here in step 2. The handler contains a method called as validate token for JWT. So we can use that method to validate the decrypted token that we have. Now this decrypted token is our JWT token. So we are validating it using the validation parameters. And if the token is valid, we are throwing out the value, and if the token is not valid, the validate token method will throw an exception, and if it is valid, it will provide us the value of the token. So this is how the validate token method works. So if an exception is thrown, the exception will be caught here in the catch block, and then we will return an authentication fail. That means the token was not able to be validated, or the token was either expired. There can be multiple reasons. If the token is not was not being able to decrypt or something, so there can be many reasons. So for that, it will throw an exception, and this exception will result in the authentication fail. But if there is no exception thrown and the token validation was successful, we will get the value of the token. Now the next step will be to check the signature of the token. So a token that we create in this application will be encrypted using security algorithm with 256-bit encryption. Now we also need to make sure that the token that is decrypted or validated has the same signature. So we will use the following JWT security token object, and we will check if its signature matches the signature that we have used to encrypt this token. If it does not match the signature, then we will return an authentication fail. So we need to validate the signature. So don't forget, only validation of the token is not enough. We also need to validate the signature of the token. So let's put this in step 14. And now let's move on to step 15, which will be extracting the email from the token. So this token, or this encrypted token that we had, JWT, it will contain the email of the user. So we need that. So we will extract this email. How do we extract this email from the token? We can use the following method from validate token object to get the email, and the method is called as validate token.claim. So let's add that. So here the validate token method will have a claims dot first or default, which is the link query that we are using here to get the first or the default result. And using the claim types dot name identifier, we can get the value of the username. So, this should be username, not the email, since we will be storing the username of the user in the token and not the email. So just to clarify this, that it's not email, it's the username. So we will extract the username of the user from the token using the validate.token.claims method. And once we have the value, we will use this username value to check if this matches the username that we have in the cookie. So here I am checking if the username that we received in the cookie matches the username that I have in the token that I have received. And the next step will be to get the email after getting the username. Now to get the email, we would need to use the username of the user and get the email of the user. So using the user manager class from ASP.NET Core Identity, we can use the find by name async method and provide the username as the parameter, and then it will use this username to find the user by its username, and we will get a result, and we will store that result in this property called as user, which is of type application user. Now we get the result, we need to check if the result is null or it's not null. So let's put a condition here to check that. So here we add a condition to check if this object here user is null. So if it's null, then we are returning an authentication fail, and if it's not null, that means we have found a user with that username. So now let's proceed to the next step. Now in the next step, we want to make sure that this user that we have belongs to the group of user roles that we have in this authentication scheme that we are creating. So here I have added a array called as user roles, and I have added administrator in that specific user role. So we are checking if this user, uh, the role of this user belongs to this user role that we have in this group. So in our case, we as of now have only one role, which is administrator, and the role of this user that which we are going to use is going to be administrator. So we will not receive any error. But let's say you want to create another role in your application, let's say, and we will call it as super admin. Now the super admin user will also be allowed to access all the methods or all the controllers or views that administrator can access. So in that case, we will have to modify this query a bit and then add administrator or super admin, and we have to then also validate the user role in this step. So in case if you want to add more roles, you can do it the way I have shown you over here, but we don't need this super admin in this particular authentication scheme. So when we proceed further in this video tutorial series, if we decide to add more roles, then we can use that array to add more roles. But for now, we are just checking that, implementing the feature where we are checking if the role of the user belongs to the user group that we have created in this authentication scheme. And now the final step will be to create a authentication ticket, because all the validation and steps have passed. So that means there were no errors received till this point, which is step 18. So we have no errors, which means all the authentication has been passed, and now we can allow the user to view the controller, view the home page or any protected view in the application, which is in the admin area. So we will create a success ticket and return that success ticket as a response. So let's go ahead and create this success ticket. So we are going to add this success ticket over here, where the validation has passed, the token is valid. So we are going to create a new claims identity, and we are going to add the claims that we have in the token. We are going to create a principal and pass this identity object to the claims principal. Then we will use this object, which is principal, to create the authentication ticket. And then finally, we are going to return this ticket as a response of authentication result.success back to the request to the client. So that should be it for the validation steps that are required to validate the admin user in the admin area. So the authentication process or the validation process needs to be very strict like this. So we cannot allow any other users other than admin to access the admin panel. And if we do, this could lead to some security flaw. If you feel like there are too many steps that are included in this validation process, you can go ahead and review it and remove the steps that you don't feel necessary while validating the users. But this is what I have implemented for authentication of the admin user, whereas I will create another authentication handler for a regular user or an app user, but we will do that when we work on the Angular project. But for now, only thing that we need is the authentication handler for admin, since we are working on the admin panel, and this is all we need. Now finally, if the authentication fails for some reason, I need to handle that, the authentication failure. So let's implement the logic for authentication failure in this handle challenge async method. Here we will add the following options. First, we will delete all the cookies from the user's browser, and we can do that by using the response.cookies.delete method, using the HTTP response.cookies.delete method. And by calling this method, we just have to provide the name of the cookie that we want to delete. And in our case, we want to delete the cookie with name, access token, and user ID. And once we delete the cookie, we want to set the response header as not authorized, and we want to redirect the user to access denied path in admin, which we have to add in the identity default options. I have not added that, so let's go ahead and add. So I have the access denied path here. So let me check what I have. Oh, access denied path. And yes, we will just call the access denied path, and the user will be redirected to the access denied path. So the access denied path in our application will be the, if we go to the app settings file in our project of the startup class, sorry, the startup project, and then we go to the app settings file, and here the access denied path is account.accessDenied. So we need to create this view. If in case you want the user to be sent to the login page, then you can change this to account.login, but we will create this access denied path. That's what we want the user to be redirected to, not to the login page. So we will create this access denied path in the next video tutorial, and we will create that view and I'll show you how to do it. But that should be it for this video tutorial, where we finished creating the admin authentication handler. In the next video tutorial, we will create the access denied path, and then we will make use of this admin authentication handler and test it.